Chapter 13, Fiscal Policy, Deficit and Debt. Fiscal policy consists of the changes made by the federal government in its budget expenditures and tax revenues to expand or contract the economy. In making these changes, the federal government may seek to increase the economy's real output and employment or control its rate of inflation. Fiscal policy is discretionary when changes in government spending or taxation are designed to change the level of real GDP, employment, incomes, or the price level. The Council of Economic Advisors advises the U.S. President on such policies. Specific actions then needs to be taken by Congress to initiate this discretionary policy. This is in contrast to non-discretionary fiscal policy that occurs automatically. Now, expansionary fiscal policy, is generally used to counteract the negative economic effects of a recession or cyclical downturn in the economy, a decline in real GDP, and rising unemployment. The purpose of the policy is to stimulate the economy by increasing aggregate demand. The policy will create a budget deficit, or when government spending is greater than tax revenues, if the budget was in balance before the policy was enacted. We assume the price level is fixed, and there are three options for increasing aggregate demand. The government can increase its discretionary spending, or the government can reduce taxes, or the government can decide to use some combination of increased government spending and tax reduction to increase aggregate demand. Now, if the government can increase its discretionary spending, the initial increase in the spending will be increased by the multiplier effect per Keynesian economics. Since the price level is fixed, real output will rise by the full extent of the multiplier effect, hopefully. Now, if the government were to reduce taxes, some of the tax cut would be saved, but some of it will be spent. Hopefully, the spent portion would provide an initial stimulus to the economy that would be magnified by the full extent of the magnifier effect, since the price level is fixed. Now, contractionary fiscal policy is a restrictive form of fiscal policy generally used to correct an inflation gap. Assume that the economy is at a full employment level of output. If aggregate demand increases, it will increase output and at the same time pull up output prices, creating demand pull inflation. If government does nothing, input prices will rise in the long run to match the increases in output prices, creating more inflation. The purpose of contractionary fiscal policy is to reduce aggregate demand pressures that increase the price level. If the government budget is balanced before the policy is enacted, it will create a budget surplus where tax revenues are greater than government spending. The contractionary effect on the economy from the initial reduction in spending from the policy will be reinforced by the multiplier effect again. Three policy options are used, but we have to take into account the ratchet effect. The price level is inflexible downward. The government can decrease spending. The government can increase taxes, or again, the government can use some combination of the two. If the government chooses to decrease spending, we assume the price level is fixed because of the ratchet effect. The multiplier will have a full effect in decreasing output, but there will be no change in the price level. Government policy will have to take into account this ratchet effect to calibrate the decline in aggregate demand so it does not cause a recession. Now, if the government increases taxes, the amount of the tax increase will need to be greater than the decrease in government spending because some of the tax increase will reduce saving and not just consumption. Now, whether the government purchases or taxes should be altered to reduce recession and control inflation depends on whether an expansion or a contraction of the public sector is desired. Economists tend to favor higher government spending during recessions and higher taxes during inflationary times if they are concerned about unmet social needs or infrastructure. Both actions either expand or preserve the size of government. Now, others tend to favor lower taxes for recessions and lower government spending during inflationary periods when they think government is too large and inefficient. Both of these actions either restrain the growth of government or reduce taxes. Now, we can talk about built-in stability, right? Built-in stability arises because net taxes change with GDP. It is desirable for spending to rise when the economy is slumping and vice versa when the economy is becoming inflationary. Automatic stability reduces instability, but it does not eliminate economic instability. Tax revenues vary directly with GDP, right? Income, sales, excise, and payroll taxes all increase when the economy is expanding and all decrease when the economy is contracting. And again, with some the idea of transfer payments and the size of automatic stability depends on the responsiveness of changes in taxes to changes in GDP. The more progressive the tax system, the greater the economy's built-in stability. A progressive tax system means the average tax rate rises with GDP. Now, however, tax revenues will rise with GDP under both progressive and proportional tax systems. Now, another name for the cyclically adjusted budget is the full employment budget. The cyclically adjusted budget measures what the federal budget deficit or surplus would be with existing taxes and government spending if the economy is at full employment. Fiscal policy is neutral when the tax revenue equals government expenditures after adjusting for the reduction in revenues from a recession. The cyclically adjusted budget deficit is 0 in years 1 and 2. Now, fiscal policy is expansionary when the cyclically adjusted budget deficit is 0 one year and there is a deficit the next year. Fiscal policy is contractionary when the cyclically adjusted budget deficit is 0 one year and followed by a cyclically adjusted budget surplus the next year. The table here shows federal deficits as a minus and surpluses as a positive, as percentages of GDP from 2000 to 2015. Observe that the cyclically adjusted deficits are generally smaller than the actual deficits. This is because the actual deficits include cyclical deficits, whereas the cyclically adjusted deficits eliminate them. The expansionary fiscal policy of the early 1990s became contractionary from 1999 to 2001. In 2002, President Bush passed tax cuts and increased unemployment benefits, thereby increasing the cyclically adjusted deficit. The 2003 tax cut increased the standardized budget deficit as a percentage of potential GDP. Federal budget deficits are expected to persist for many years to come. Now, in 2008, Congress passed an economic stimulus package of $152 billion, consisting of checks to taxpayers, veterans, and Social Security recipients, and some tax breaks for businesses. This package didn't work to stimulate the economy as hoped. So in 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was enacted. It consists of $787 billion of tax rebates and large amounts of government expenditures. This came after the government had already spent $700 billion for financial institutions in the TARP. Now, recognition lag is the elapsed time between the beginning of a recession or inflation and awareness of this occurrence. The lag between the time the need for fiscal policy is recognized and the time action is taken is referred to as administrative lag. Operational lag, then, is the time elapsed between the change in policy and its impact on the economy. A political business cycle may destabilize the economy, right? Election years have been characterized by more expansionary policies regardless of economic conditions. And households may believe that tax reduction is temporary and save a large portion of their tax cuts, right, reducing the magnitude of the effect desired by policymakers. And we can also bring in the idea of state and local finance policies and what can happen with the crowding out effect, right, with government deficit spending. It may increase the interest rate and reduce private spending, which weakens or cancels the stimulus of fiscal policy. Now, some economists oppose the use of fiscal policy, right, believing that monetary policy is more effective or that the economy is sufficiently self-correcting. Most economists support the use of fiscal policy to help push the economy in the desired direction and the use of monetary policy for more fine-tuning. Economists agree that the potential impacts, positive and negative, of fiscal policy on long-term productivity growth should be evaluated and considered in the decision-making process, along with the short-run cyclical effects. Now, this next portion is talking about the U.S. public debt. The national or public debt is the total accumulation of the federal government's total deficits and surpluses that have occurred throughout time. Deficits, and by extension the debt, are the result of war financing, recessions, and the lack of political will to reduce or avoid them. Now, some of the things we have debt through are treasury bills, which are short-term securities, treasury notes, medium-term security or medium length time frame, treasury bonds, long-term securities, right, and U.S. saving bonds, which are long-term non-marketable securities. This figure shows the ownership of the total public debt as of 2015. You can see U.S. individuals own 4% of the debt, U.S. banks have 10%, right? 34% is foreign ownership of our U.S. national debt. And our U.S. national debt, right, held by the public, excluding the Federal Reserve, as a percentage of GDP. Interest charges are the main burden imposed by the debt because government always has to at least pay the interest on the debt in order to remain in good credit standing. Can the government go bankrupt? Not really. And there's reasons why it cannot. The government can raise taxes to pay back the debt, and it can also borrow more to refinance bonds when they mature. Right. The government has the power to tax, which businesses and individuals do not have when they are in debt. Now, does the debt impose a burden on future generations? In 2015, the per capita federal debt in the U.S. was $56,368. But the public debt is a public credit. Your grandmother may own the bonds on which taxpayers are paying interest. Someday you may inherit those bonds that are assets to those who have them. The true burden is borne by those who pay taxes or loan government money today to finance government spending. If the spending is for productive purposes, it will enhance future earning power and the size of bonds that are and the size of the debt relative to future GDP and population could actually decline. Borrowing allows growth to occur when it is invested in productive capital. And this will be discussed by the Milton Friedman video this week. Now, some issues. Repayment of the debt affects income distribution. If working taxpayers will be paying interest to the mainly wealthier groups who hold the bonds, right, this probably increases income inequality. Since interest must be paid out of government revenues, a large debt and high interest can increase the tax burden and may decrease incentives to work, save, and invest for taxpayers. A higher proportion of the debt is owed to foreigners than in the past, and this can increase the burden since payments leave the country. But Americans also own foreign bonds, and this slightly offsets the concern. Additionally, some economists believe that public borrowing crowds out private investment, but the extent is unclear. Finally, Social Security is the major public retirement program in the U.S. Half of the tax is paid by individuals and half is paid by employers. The Medicare program is a health care program for people age 65 and older in the U.S. Again, half of the tax is paid by individuals and half is paid by employers. There is an impending long-run shortfall in Social Security funding. Right? It is a pay-as-you-go system, meaning that current revenues are used to pay current retirees. Despite efforts to develop a trust fund, right, eventually Social Security revenues will fall below payouts to retirees. Baby boomers are entering retirement age and living longer, meaning there will be more recipients receiving payouts for longer periods of time. As well, the ratio of the number of workers contributing to the system for each recipient has declined. Now, numerous solutions have been suggested, and each has an economic trade-off. Reduce benefits by reducing direct payments, taxing benefits, and/or increasing the age at which workers are eligible to receive benefits. Now, or increase revenues by raising payroll taxes, right? Increase the trust fund by setting aside more of current system revenues, or by investing trust fund monies in corporate stocks and bonds. Additionally, one solution is to allow workers to invest half their payroll taxes in improved stocks and bond funds. This is sometimes considered to be privatizing Social Security. There are many possible solutions, and the political process may well result in the combination of the many policies proposed.